Question. Hey Kim, I was wondering if you could talk about the critical initiation at the 96th level of consciousness. Perhaps how you experienced it personally. Is it as dramatic a shift as the shift at the 48th level? Also, some of your books say that if you fall at the 96th level, you fall to the lowest. I was wondering how this happens if you can't skip steps going up or down. Or is this a special case? Also, for the sake of completion, could you talk about what happens if you do fail this initiation? Is there a difference between beings who fall in this sphere versus fallen beings who have failed it in earlier spheres? Thank you as always. Okay, so just to set the stage for people who might be new to this concept. What the Ascended Masters have explained is that when you look at people on Earth, the only way to really explain the different behaviors you see is that people are at different levels of consciousness. And the levels of consciousness can be put on a scale, where at the lowest end of the scale there are people who are completely selfish, self-centered, only care about themselves. They don't care how their actions affect other people, what kind of suffering they cause for other people. And then as you go to higher and higher levels, people overcome this self-centeredness, this selfishness, and they become more aware of the whole, that we are all connected, and that what you do to others affects yourself. So therefore they become less and less selfish and self-centered, more willing to work on raising the whole. So the Masters also explain that when you first descend to Earth, you descend to the 48th level. And at the 48th level, you have a sense of connection to your higher self. And the important point of that is that you actually experience, it's not something you believe theoretically, you experience that you are connected to something outside of your outer mind. And the outer mind is made up of these, what we might call the four lower bodies, which is the identity level, where you have your sense of identity, the mental level, where you have your thought processes, the emotional level, where you have your feelings, and then the physical body. That also has a certain mind that's almost like a computer that runs the body. So at the 48th level, you know you are a being who came from outside the material world, and you took on these four bodies. So you know there's more to your sense of self, more to your identity than these four bodies here on Earth. So basically, we have two choices at the 48th level. We can seek to increase our sense of connection, and that's what basically all valid spiritual teachings are about, helping us expand our sense of connection. So we become more and more connected and become willing to work on the whole, work for the whole, for raising the whole. The other option is that we go below the 48th level, where we go into the illusion that we are separate beings. And as separate beings, we can do whatever we want, and we have a right to do whatever we want, because we think the basic illusion at that level is that if I hurt you, it's not going to affect me. I can get away with things. And then people become increasingly more selfish as they go below the 48th level. So what the Masters explain is that the spiritual path, irregardless of what spiritual teachings people are following, now, we have many different valid spiritual teachings out there, but the spiritual path is actually about growing from the 48th level and up to the highest, which is the 144th level. But the Masters also explain that there is the first stage of this growth is actually that because the Earth is an unnatural planet with a low level of collective consciousness, you are rising above, you're pulling yourself above the collective consciousness. And you do this by building a spiritual sense of self. You're basically building a self as a spiritual person who is not doing what most people are doing on planet Earth. You're not focused on the material aspects of life, for example, but more on the spiritual. So in a sense, you could say that the spiritual path, it requires you to be focused on yourself. Because instead of just mindlessly flowing along with the currents in the collective consciousness, you are going against the stream. And you're doing this as an individual. So you're building a strong sense of individuality in order to rise yourself above the collective. Because most people who are following the collective don't have a strong sense of individuality. They're just doing whatever is the trends, whatever is the fashion trends. If it's red this year, I wear red, or whatever, you know. People do all kinds of things where they're not really thinking as individuals, they're just following the crowd. So you are pulling yourself as an individual above this. And then you reach the 96th level. And at the 96th level, there's this critical initiation, which is, can you, having pulled yourself above the collective consciousness, can you see that the self that you used to pull yourself above the next up to the 96th level can't take you beyond? In other words, the self that you used, which was a valid self at the time, it has outlived its usefulness, and you need to let it go, let it die, let it fall away. You can compare it to a rocket, right? You start a rocket at the ground level. It has this huge fuel tank with a booster at the bottom that is meant to take it up to a certain height above the earth. And then, ideally, the booster is meant to separate and fall back to earth. And then the rocket starts the second stage that takes it higher. So ideally, the self that took you to the 96th level, you need to separate yourself from it. So the conscious you separates itself from this vehicle that it used to get to that level, and just let it fall away. But some people can get attached to this self and say, but wait, I spent all of this effort developing this very spiritual self, and I feel very spiritual compared to all these people who are not spiritual. I'm not willing to let that die. I'm not willing to let it go. I want to keep growing it and make it more and more perfect. And this is where people can become trapped in what I, in several videos, have called the outer path, where you basically think that if you perfect this spiritual self, one day it'll be led into heaven, and you will become immortal or ascend or however you see it. But that's a complete illusion, and it's a dangerous illusion that many spiritual people have fallen into. Because that self, basically you can say, for every time you take a step up on the ladder of the 144th, there's a certain self that you're allowed to let die, and you're reborn into a new sense of self. But there is that big step at the 96th level where you have to overcome the focus on yourself. Basically, and I remember going through this myself, the person is asking about how I experienced it. For years, my motto was, it's not about me. It's not about me. Because I realized that it was not about building this sophisticated separate self. And so the thing is, what do people do? What happens if people are not willing to start? It's not like you have to give up the self all at once. It's a process that takes time. But if people aren't willing to start that process, if they don't see it, if they either don't get the idea because they were never told by a spiritual teacher, or they deny it, they refuse to give up the self, what happens then? And I have some of the early teachings that were given that in the book Master Keys to Spiritual Freedom, for example. It talks about how you actually fall then from the 96th level to the lowest level. And this is a little tricky to understand. I understand it can sound contradictory. And in order to really grasp it, how to explain it best? Well, let's look at this, what I said. When you go below the 48th level, you'll go into this state where you become more and more self-focused, self-centered. And you can go to the lowest level that's possible on earth. You have beings there who are completely focused on themselves. And the example that the masters often use is, you look at history and some of these dictators that have caused wars that caused millions of people to be killed, or people who are willing to torture others or destroy them in various ways. So that's an example of people who are at the lowest, most selfish state of consciousness. But it's actually not the only example of it, because there are people at the lowest level of consciousness on earth who appear perfectly benign and actually appear to be good people, even spiritual people. There are spiritual teachers, we might call them false teachers, who are at the lowest level of consciousness in terms of being the most self-focused. So in other words, when you are at the lowest level of consciousness, you are completely focused on yourself. This doesn't mean that you are acting in an evil way that are killing or torturing other people. You could act in a way where you put on a facade of being a good person, even a good leader of society who's trying to do the best for everybody, or, as I said, a spiritual person or a pope or whatever. But you're doing it from a completely self-centered perspective where you are seeking to control other people or ensnare other people to basically make them worship you as some very important, almost godlike figure on earth. And this is what the fallen beings have done. So what the teaching is that if you fail the initiation, if you deny the initiation at the 96th level, you can fall to these very low levels, because if you're not willing to give up the self you built up until the 96th level, the spiritual self, you must embody that self. And then you go into this idea of wanting to perfect that self and make it seem spiritual based on criteria that you define instead of the spiritual law defined by the Ascended Masters. So I would say that at the 96th level, there's some leeway there. It's not like it's an all or nothing thing. It's not like you come to this dramatic point where now you either have to step up or you fall. Because, you know, there can be a certain period where a being, you don't really grasp what the initiation is about at the 96th level. You just don't understand it. But then there can come a point where a being does understand it and consciously denies it, refuses to step up to that being less self-centered. And that's when the being then falls down to because the being is there. You know, it's basically the being has now seen what the higher levels of the path are about. It is about letting the spiritual self die and really overcoming self-centeredness, self-focus. But the person refuses to do this and decides that it wants to continue perfecting the spiritual self. And that's why you go down. I don't know if you'd necessarily fall to the very lowest level, but you certainly go down into these being focused on self and raising up the separate self to this godlike status. And so if we need to talk just very quickly, this is what the fallen beings did in a previous sphere. I explained that in my video about how the world was created. That there were beings who failed this initiation in a previous sphere. And they have had a very long time to make the separate self seem very sophisticated. So there can also be beings who started in this sphere, and therefore they are not fallen beings. If you haven't fallen when a sphere ascended, you're not really a fallen being, but you can be in the fallen consciousness. And so there can be a being who started in this sphere, started at the 48th level, and maybe went into duality and then found the spiritual path, went back to the 48th level and worked its way up to the 96th level. But then it consciously and deliberately refuses to let the self die, and therefore it falls into that extreme self-focus. And it can very quickly then actually come to admire the fallen beings. That's often what happens, that it's almost like you can say that at the 96th level, if you don't decide to enter the path of overcoming selfishness, which means you start working either with a genuine spiritual teacher or with the ascended masters, then you will attract to yourself a false teacher, who is often a fallen being. And a fallen being will then justify why you don't give up this self, and supposedly, this is what the ascended masters call the left-handed path, where you follow this fallen being who has such a momentum on elevating the separate self that it can very quickly help you become so good at elevating the separate self. So we can say that when you fall at the 96th level, you don't become a fallen being. You don't become a fallen being until the sphere ascends, but you fall into the go into the fallen consciousness, and you become extremely self-focused. You are seeking to elevate this spiritual self, but it's still a separate self. It's still a separate self because it was separate compared to the collective consciousness. So you actually come to see yourself as being better than people. And that's what you need to start overcoming, where you start really attaining oneness with a Christ mind, where you see that nobody's better than anybody else. We are all out of the Christ mind. And in oneness, there can be no better or worse. I mean, these are dualistic concepts. So you can say that you can say that when we go below the 48th level, we use the duality consciousness to create the separate self. And ideally, by rising from the 48th to the 96th level, we should have come to see through the weaknesses of the duality consciousness. But if you don't, then you will use the duality consciousness to justify keeping the spiritual self you built and not letting it die. And then you will fall right into using the duality consciousness to now elevate the spiritual self. So, okay, so that's as far as that goes. The other part of the question, how did I personally experience this? Well, actually, what it says here, 96th level, is it as dramatic a shift as the shift at the 48th level? Well, actually, the shift at the 48th level is not very dramatic. It is dramatic in the sense that you shift from being connected to being separate, but you don't see it that way. Inside your own mind, it's almost imperceptible. I mean, you're not really aware at the 48th level of your higher self up there and the spiritual realm. You just have a sense you're connected to something. And when you go to the 47th level, you lose that sense of connection, but you are reborn into a sense of identity as a separate being, but you don't really understand what that means. So it's not like the experience you have is not that dramatic. It's not like a really big shift. You do sense you've lost something, but you're not really aware of what you've lost. That's why a duality consciousness is so subtle, is so slippery. You recall from the Genesis that the serpent was in the garden, and the serpent was the most subtle of the animals, because the serpentine mind is very subtle. And that's why, Adam and Eve, when they ate the forbidden fruit, which is the duality consciousness, they didn't realize what they had done. They didn't really, well, they saw they were naked, but, it wasn't really like, they were still alive, right? They felt. But you weren't actually alive. You had, you had died and been reborn into a new sense of identity as a separate being. But it didn't feel like a big shift. Okay, so again, at the 96th level, it's not that it's this big dramatic shift. This is important to understand. And this is one of the big values of this teaching about the 144 levels, because you see a lot of people out there who are talking about, this has become trendy, spiritual awakening or enlightenment. And they're all dreaming about this instant experience that is so dramatic that now they are, from being whatever level of consciousness they were at, now they are at the ultimate level of consciousness on earth. And that's not what happens at the 96th level. It's not a dramatic shift. It is a decisive shift in a certain way, but you don't experience it as that dramatic, because there's a ways from the 96th to the 144th level. So what happens at the 96th level? When you pass the initiation, You're not instantly enlightened. You're not instantly become have your full Christhood. You go from the 96th level to the 97th level, which is a step up. And then, as you keep going, you go from the 97th to the 98th, which is a relatively small step up. And you just keep going. And after you have gone for a while, you might look back and say, wow, something really has happened. But it's not like there's this one humongous epiphany. And it's really important to understand that. So you're not expecting this. You're not running after this carrot that's dangling in front of your nose, because it's the ego that's dangling the carrot. But how did I personally experience it? Well, I found a spiritual path in 1976. And I found the Center Master Teachings in, I think, 1984. At least I really went into it in 1984. So for many years, I was just walking the path, using the Center Master Teachings, giving all these decrees. And really, I was really contemplating, because in the Summit Lighthouse, there was a lot of teachings about the path to Christhood, personal Christhood. And I was really contemplating what that meant from various angles. And I was also very diligent in giving decrees, giving hours and hours of decrees. And so I was trying to live up to all these outer demands of what it meant to be a spiritual student. But there came a point, well, there were two really dramatic shifts that happened for me. One was in the early 1990s, when the masters in the summit, through the dictation, started talking about the need to resolve psychology. And it really hit me, and I started really thinking about what does it mean to resolve psychology. I didn't have the concept of the separate selves back then, but I had some idea of it. And then sometime after that, I really started grasping. Mother Mary gave some dictations through Elizabeth Care Prophet, where she talked about the need to surrender, the importance of surrender. And that hit me too. And I realized that resolving psychology in the end was a matter of surrendering something. And at the time, the concept I had was that the Buddha had talked about overcoming attachments. And it was very inspiring for me. I think sometimes in the 1990s, I had this inner vision. It wasn't an outer teaching. It was just an inner vision of Gautama was sitting under the tree as the final initiation, and he was confronted by the demons of Mara. And I realized that if he had had any unresolved psychology, he couldn't have gone into nirvana, because it would have pulled him back. The demons had something they could pull on. Like Jesus said, the prince of this world comes and has nothing in me. So I started understanding that unresolved psychology causes you to become attached to something on earth, or something in your own self-image. The way you look at yourself, the way you look at the path, you are attached to something. And the key to spiritual growth is to come to see this attachment and consciously let it go. You surrender it. You surrender, you give it up. And so I was really working with those ideas up through the 90s. And then comes 2002, Elizabeth Care Prophet had retired in 1997, was no longer active. Actually, shortly after that, I moved away from the Summit Lighthouse in Montana, where they had their headquarters. So I actually moved to Utah, and I was got a normal job with a company, but I was still walking the spiritual path. I just wasn't active in the Summit organization anymore. And there were two things that happened. I had my birthday in 2001. And I was in my office where I had these pictures. I had the chart of the Iron Presence and the pictures of Saint Germain and Jesus. And suddenly, without having thought about it, I just looked at those pictures and I said, I want more. I've followed your teachings for this long. I want more direct contact with you. And I meant the masters. And it was just came to me spontaneously, and then I didn't think more about it. But then in the following year, 2002, in August, I had this experience where I was sitting in my office and I was decreeing. I decreed for some time. And suddenly I literally saw how what had driven my spiritual path, all of the effort, all of the eagerness I had put into being a good spiritual student, all of this was driven by ego, an aspect of the ego. Not in a bad, selfish way, but it was to focus on myself. I just saw it. Totally without any forethought or analysis. I just saw this. It was like, And the way I can describe it today, of course, was that my conscious you stepped outside of my four lower bodies, and it saw that what had driven my growth up to that point was these separate selves that I had in my identity, mental, and emotional bodies. And this is really what I talked about here. The spiritual self that I had built throughout those many years on the path. I had built a spiritual self that had pulled me above the collective consciousness. But I saw that it was still a self, and it was still an aspect of ego, because I was still focused on myself and wanting to feel special, wanting to feel I'd done something important on earth. And there was always this other self that was frustrated because I hadn't done something decisive, I wasn't famous, I hadn't written a best-selling book about spirituality and this and that. So I saw that there was this human ambition. There was a certain self that projected, oh, I did all this for the Ascended Masters. Oh, I am really one of the advanced spiritual students. I'm here to save the world for Saint Germain and help bring the Golden Age. And that's why I did all this. But suddenly I shifted out of this and I saw, oh my God, it's all just human ambition. It's all just human nonsense. And then I really felt, it wasn't a conscious decision. I just felt something broke inside of me. I just let it go. It's like I saw it, and I saw it's not me. It was literally the conscious you stepped outside of this self and saw, this is a self. This is not who I am. And then spontaneously, I just let it go. It just sort of faded away, melted away. And then it was like I had this interval where, what do I do now? I mean, how do I even live on this planet? What's my purpose for being? There's no purpose for being here. I had no personal ambition anymore. I had the personal ambition to be a good spiritual student and reach a higher level of consciousness and do something important. But now I had no ambition. And so that's when I remember, I think I even said it out loud. I said, God, you can take me home right now. And before that, I had all this ambition. I would have said, I can't possibly leave this planet until I've done something important. But now it's like I could have left in that moment. I literally felt I was standing there looking at Earth, my life on Earth, and I could have walked around and walked away from it all and had no regrets. Nothing I needed to do, nothing unfinished. I could just leave it all behind. And that's then when I had this inner voice, and I knew it was Jesus. I just sensed his presence. And he said, well, if you don't have anything you personally want to do on this planet, are you willing to do something for me? And just spontaneously, from the deepest recesses of my being came this, yes, yes. And that's when he started training me to do the Ask Real Jesus website. So you see what I did here. I'm realizing this. I first said it isn't such a dramatic shift at the 96 level, and then I tell this experience, which of course seems dramatic. So, you know, how to deal with that, because I just think, okay, so I think what I'm trying to get to here is the real shift that happened was that I saw the human ambition that had brought me to that level. I saw it was a self, and I experienced that I, as the conscious you, I'm not the self. And I think that's the important part. Whatever came after will be individual for you. And I'm not saying that you have to necessarily come to the same kind of dramatic experience, because for me it felt like a very dramatic experience. But when I look back at it, it was, of course, I'd gone through a long process before I was ready to see this. I'm not even saying I was necessarily at the 96 level. I could have gone a little bit above the 96 level at that point. Before I had the breakthrough, what I'm saying is. So I'm just trying to say I'm describing the experience honestly how I experienced it, but I'm trying to say, don't expect that the exact same thing is going to happen to you, because you might set yourself up for disappointment. It might be a more gradual process. But and what I'm saying is that also, which I think is very important, is yes, I had this very decisive experience. I started working on the Ask Will Jesus website. I started taking dictations on the masters, became a messenger. But it doesn't mean that I had resolved all of my psychology. I still, for years and years and years, had various issues in my psychology that came up that I was dealing with. And as I've explained in many of my videos, I'm still seeing things in my psychology. So what I'm trying to say again is you can have this shift, but you still have psychology to resolve about the 96 level. You're still taking one step at a time up. And when I look back at this was 2002. And I would say that until 2022, I really didn't start overcoming, I really didn't fully overcome this focus on self. Maybe I haven't fully overcome it, maybe. But I certainly have. It's been another breakthrough here in the last couple of years, because even when I became a messenger, it was very clear I was not doing this for my own ambition. I really, I was a member of the Summit Lighthouse for like 15 years. I sat there and listened to 300 or 400 live dictations that Elizabeth Clare Prophet took as a messenger. And she was an amazing messenger. She built this whole, persona, this whole, situation around taking these dictations from the Ascended Masters. We often gave hours of decrees before we got a dictation, and she could take some very, very high dictations, very high language, and so I had no dissatisfaction with her as a messenger. I had no thought that she wasn't a good messenger, or she could be a messenger, or that I could be a messenger. I never had an ambition to be a messenger. It never even crossed my mind. And so what I'm saying is that for the first years, I did come. It took me several years before I could really accept myself as a messenger. But I still had that some awareness of how she had done things, and that I was very different from her. No way I could do what she was doing. And I had to find my own way. And so I still had a certain self-focus. In other words, I wasn't doing it out of a personal ambition, but I still had a certain sensitivity to how other people looked at it, or how I myself looked at it. Was I good enough as a messenger? And that took me some time to work through that. And so what I'm saying is that, yes, I had a dramatic shift, but even then I still had psychology to deal with. And that's, again, the 96. It's a small step up to the 97, small step up to the 98, and so on. So it's like you can say that at the 96 level, you really lock into this. It's not about me. I'm not doing this service for any personal gain, or even the sense that I'm doing something important, or that I'm famous, or people should look up to me, or admire me, or see me as someone special. You're not doing it for that reason. But you can still have a certain unresolved psychology that makes you focused on yourself, how you see yourself, how other people see you. And that's what you gradually work through as you go above the 96th level. And then at a certain point, this just starts fading away. And it did, really probably 10, 12 years ago, it really started fading away. But really the last couple of years, it was like, it just doesn't matter to me anymore. How people see me. It doesn't matter to me what level of consciousness I'm at. It doesn't matter to me whether I'm famous or not, whether I have a best-selling book or not. I'm just at peace with giving the service I'm giving and being who I am and expressing myself. And so what I'm trying to say is that there's still a process above the 96th level where we're not driven by a personal ambition, but we can still have that self-awareness, self-conscious of how we're giving our service. And it's important to be aware of that because, as I said, it's not like I was suddenly enlightened or awakened in 2002 when I had that experience, even though it was traumatic. I still had to deal with my psychology after that experience. So I think that's very, very important to keep that in mind, because it's another thing that can happen, I think, that can trip people up at the 96 level, is that you feel like, well, let's step back a little bit. When we find the spiritual path, let's say we find the spiritual path at the 48th level. We obviously have a long way to go to 144th. But what we do when we start the spiritual path is that we gradually start shifting our priorities away from a worldly material life towards a more spiritual focus on life. So we have to give up certain things in the world. And we have to have motivation for doing this. There has to be a payoff. What do we think we are going to get out of it? So we're at the 48th level. We just see ourselves as connected to something. We don't really know what we're connected to. We don't really understand the spiritual realm. We might not even really know about ascended masters. I think many spiritual people can walk probably to the 96th level without really realizing that ascended masters exist. So we have to have some motivation. And for many people, it's that something dramatic is going to happen. However we see it. I remember even back in the TM days, many people were focused on this cosmic consciousness. This was the goal in TM. If you meditated long enough, you would reach cosmic consciousness just by meditating. So in the summit, it was Christ consciousness. And so as we are raising our consciousness from the 48th to the 96th level, we are raising our consciousness. We are learning a lot of things. We are increasing our understanding. We are raising our level of awareness. We are coming closer and closer to Christ consciousness in the sense that we have a certain discernment. We have a certain sense that there's a higher state of mind. But the thing is, we can still have, as I just described, this self that's based on an outer human ambition of elevating ourselves to some special status. It's not only we can have it, we will have it, because that's what drives us to reach for the 96th level. And so what I'm saying is, we saw that goal a certain way at the 48th level. We may have refined it as we're going to the 96th level, but it can still very much be colored by this outer ambition. So the real trick here is, can we let go of this? In other words, it's an ambition focused on yourself. You are raising yourself compared to the mass consciousness and other people. But it's still focused on you. And that, in order to get beyond the 96th level, that has to go. It has to die. It has to be surrendered. And you have to, it doesn't have to be surrendered maybe completely. I'm not sure it has to be surrendered completely at the 96th level. But you at least have to start seeing it. I think what happened to me was I did surrender that human ambition, but that was because it was part of my divine plan to be a messenger for the masters, and I couldn't be a messenger out of human ambition. So I had to come to that point where I surrendered that. But I think, as I said, there was a process that led me to that point. So I think even beyond the 96th level, you can probably still have some human, I don't know how to say it. You can probably still have some colored view of what it means to grow spiritually. But I think you have to come to a point where you really, you understand that it's not about you. It's not about making yourself special. There has to be a higher purpose for your growth, for what you're doing. However you log into that. And I obviously, the Ascended Master Teachings isn't the only way for people to rise beyond this 96th level, because then nobody would have ascended in the past, right? So it's a matter of how people see it. You have to somehow shift away from this being focused on giving your outer self is special status in the world, to where you are selflessly serving. You're saying, it's not about a payout anymore. It's not about me getting something out of it. I would just want to give this service because it's right. It's what I feel is important for me. And for me, that was the Ascended Masters. And you could say that I saw this self, I saw the human ambition, I let it drop. But that was just the final letting go of it. I had taken years before that where I had started seeing my focus on the outer self, and I had started tuning into the masters and realizing that beyond how I saw myself and the importance of myself and my service, there was the masters that had a completely different vision. And I had started gradually realizing that the vision of the masters was not focused on me. Saint Germain has a plan for the golden age. And it was not focused on me. I was not the one who was single-handedly going to bring the golden age into manifestation. This is what my human self thought. And many people in the Summit Lighthouse thought the same about themselves. I can look back and see. But it wasn't about me. And I remember one of the big breakthroughs that came to me was that I looked at one point, it must have been probably mid-1990s or something, I suddenly looked at the Summit Lighthouse organization and how specific it was and how they had a certain culture, a certain demands, and a certain sense that we were the most spiritually advanced students on the planet and we were saving the world for Saint Germain. I suddenly looked at this and it was like I tuned into Saint Germain and I realized that if you're an Ascended Master and you're charged with bringing a golden age to an entire planet, you couldn't possibly let this depend on this little group of a few thousand people in Montana having a very specific view of themselves as important. You couldn't possibly let the future of the planet depend on such few people. So I realized that Saint Germain has to work with millions of people who are part of bringing the golden age by receiving some kind of idea from him and implementing it in some aspect of society. In the summit, there was this culture that one day it would be recognized that we were the ones that were just as important as Jesus' disciples, and we were the ones who brought the golden age. And I realized this couldn't be Saint Germain's vision, because when I saw how people in the summit, they could change their minds and they could go back and forth, and I thought, no, you can't possibly let the future of the planet depend on this group of people, including myself. And so that's why when I really started contemplating this, that the Ascended Masters look at me completely differently than my ego looks at me. And I started contemplating the difference, tuning into the difference. And I started locking into this, and that's why, as I can say, becoming a messenger, it was not a human ambition. It was not an outer ambition, not something I wanted. It was not something I wanted to get something out of. I just wanted to give the service, because giving the service is the reward in itself. It really is the reward in itself. Just experiencing the masters, receiving something from the masters, passing it on, that in itself is the reward. I mean, feeling part of the flow and finding my little place in this enormous tapestry of bringing in a golden age and transforming a planet from an unnatural planet to a natural planet. And once in a while I would have these glimpses of the master's consciousness. And I don't know when I first time, oh yeah, I know when I first time had it. That was back in 1998, when Elizabeth Care Prophet confronted me with an aspect of my ego, and I decided to not defend it, let it go. And then I sat down and I experienced this unconditional love from El Moya, Master Moore. Just this completely pink love. And it was so different from the image of El Moya they had in the summit, which is strict disciplinarian. And I just experienced that the Master's consciousness is so infinitely beyond my own. And I had various experiences with that throughout the years, where just in a glimpse, I was like, oh, there's so much more, there's so much wider consciousness than my own. And just tuning into that consciousness, experiencing that consciousness, what bigger reward, what reward could you possibly need compared to this? And I think this is an important shift there you could possibly apply when you get closer to the 96 level, where you realize that your ambitions, your human ambitions, your ego ambitions that have driven you on the path so far, they're just like nothing compared to the Master's consciousness. And I think if you open yourself up, if you try to be neutral, if you ask the Masters, first of all, I would ask the Masters, I want to experience your mind. Pick a Master close to you. I want to experience your mind, your being. Show me what stands in the way of that experience. And essentially, that's what the entire new book, Connecting to Your Spiritual Teachers, is about, that we're almost completing this ritual of doing all these invocations. So you could take that book and your goal really is just to experience the presence of a Master, the consciousness of a Master. Because when you experience that, that's what's going to drive you to let go of that spiritual, very spiritual self you built to get to the 96th level. It's just about experiencing the Masters, nothing else. Whatever comes will come out of that experience of connecting to the Masters, because it's not about you anymore deciding with the outer mind, having this human ambition of what you should do or what you should accomplish or what should happen to you, how special you should be. It's not about that. So the first thing really is to experience the Masters, so everything that comes after flows from the Masters. You could say that below the 96th level, you're still driven by that outer ambition, which is perfectly all right. You needed that, as I said, needed that ambition to get there. But when you shift beyond the 96th level, it all comes from above. It comes from your I Am Presence, from the Masters. It's not about you anymore. It's not about you being special among other people. It's not about you. It all comes from your I Am Presence and from the Masters. Like Jesus said, I can of my own self do nothing. The Father within me, the I Am Presence within me, doeth the work. The Masters within me doeth the work. And that is, if you can make that shift, where instead of trying to think that, now you should be in this special state of consciousness, or now you should have this special status on earth, and now people should admire you, you can make the shift to saying, I just want to experience an ascended Master. I just want to experience the Master's presence and being. Then I think that'll be a great help for you. And then you just pursue that, and then you see what comes to you from within, without that outer analytical mind and ambition. So anyway, I know this is kind of rambling and it might seem contradictory, but I hope it helps somebody. I could basically say, if you're at that level where you need it, it'll help you. And if you're not at that level, it'll probably seem confusing to you. But anyway,